Have you ever heard people say, oh, set goals, they're super helpful? And I've had no clue how to go about that other than, oh, I want to be rich by 35, or, for example, I want to travel the world. You might even be a very go with the flow person, and goals aren't really your thing. What if I said that using psychology, you can genuinely optimize the way you set goals? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the psychosocial approach. Today we're going to be discussing goal setting and goal striving, two related concepts that, when applied correctly, can really and truly elevate your productivity and, without sounding too clickbaity, eventually change your life. But before we even really get into goal setting and goal striving, let's break down our constructs like usual, and we'll start with plans. People tend to hold a mental representation of an ideal state of behavior, environment, or events. Whenever there's a mismatch between reality and the ideal, that leads to incongruity, which is quite uncomfortable. When the incongruity grows to become sufficiently uncomfortable, people make and execute a plan to remove it. So here's an example. My ideal state is to feel full. But let's say I'm in the middle of a class, I'm in the middle of a lecture, and I'm a little hungry. There's a mismatch right now between my ideal state and my current state. But I'm uncomfortable, but I can push through. Once the lecture is over, I'm feeling very, very hungry. The incongruity has grown, and so has the discomfort. So I make a plan to find somewhere nice to eat and remove that discomfort. Obviously, a bit of a basic idea, but it illustrates the concept. People on a subconscious level operate on something referred to as the TOTE model, and that stands for test, operate, test, exit. By initially testing, we compare the present state with our ideal state. If it matches, we can exit immediately. If it doesn't match, we move to operate and act on the environment in some way to realize that ideal state. Once it's completed, we test once again. If it doesn't match, we go back to operate. And if it does match, we exit as our present state is in incongruity with our ideal state. Just by knowing this framework instead of relying on it subconsciously can really help narrow down choices and help you act if you're stuck on decisions or tend to have difficulty making them in general. I personally write down the TOTE on my main iPad screen and always refer back to it whenever I'm overthinking. Is something wrong? Can I do something about it right now? If the answer is yes, I proceed and do it. If not, I leave it until it's ready to be dealt with. Let's say you've made a goal and are having slight issues achieving it. What's the next step? According to John Marshall Reeve, we should engage in corrective motivation. We can change the plan, we can change the behavior by increasing our effort, or we can withdraw from the plan. The TLDR here is we use a behavior to reduce the discrepancy or distance between our present and our ideal states. It's important to note that there are different types of discrepancies when thinking of goals. One of them is discrepancy reduction, and one is discrepancy creation. Despite being opposites, they're crucial in goal setting and striving due to their purpose. With discrepancy reduction, you can see that people receive environmental feedback in terms of getting closer to the goal. People overcome previous deficiencies, and it underlines the concept of planning and corrective motivation. With discrepancy creation, you can see individuals looking forward and imagining a prospective future, so an imagined ideal state. They're pursuing growth. And instead of being reactive to environmental feedback, they're proactive in creating the ideal state that doesn't exist yet. This is obviously achieved through setting goals. You're intentionally creating that incongruent state of discomfort and are uncomfortable enough in your present state to act on changing it. When discussing goals, people that generally in life set goals tend to outperform those who do not as a result of the direct attention on the achievement. But not all goals are created equal. There are three key features to consider when analyzing your goals. Goal difficulty. How hard is the goal to accomplish? The effort required is proportional to the difficulty, right? So I want to eat less junk food versus I want to be president of the United States. I think we can all agree that one is clearly harder than the other. For example, I don't think I could ever eat less junk food. It's impossible. The second feature is goal specificity. How clearly does the goal inform the performer of precisely what to do? This is so important because it reduces the ambiguity in thought and the variability in performance. Let's say one of your main goals is to get a great job in the future. Well, that's phenomenal. That's obviously a great step, but it's very, very vague. How do you get a great job? Okay, let's break it down. Well, you'd have to have good grades, which means that you'll have to do well in your courses. Maybe make a resume, get some experience volunteering, or even internships. Let's take it a step further. How do you do well in your courses? Okay, you have to study well, right? You use methods like active recall, spaced repetition, right? Study groups. You'd have to obviously go to all of your lectures, not skip any classes, and do the required readings. To create a resume, you have to find a great template. You have to write it out, maybe even get some feedback on it from a professional. And to get an internship, you must research and gather information, apply and connect. See how we just took a very vague goal and created a step-by-step pathway that's easy to see and follow. Now, the process certainly isn't easy, right? But having that specific framework makes each step much more easy to follow. The last feature is goal congruence. How well is this goal self-endorsed and authentic to you? The more self-concordant it is, the more you'll leverage your own personal resources to accomplish it. Let's use another example. Let's say your parents want you to be a famous soccer player, and that's always been your specific dream. You're a lot more likely to give 1,000% each and every practice, as opposed to someone that wants to be a basketball player, but their parents aren't convinced of that and still put them on a soccer team, right? They won't leverage their personal resources to accomplish that. So, just kind of summarize here very briefly. When you're setting a goal, it should be difficult to an extent that will energize the behavior, which increases your effort, and sustains the behavior, which makes you work longer. The goal should be concordant, that will energize you, that'll sustain you, and will direct behavior, which increases the overall attention and creates an efficiency forward mindset. You're looking to constantly streamline the process to achieve that goal. And notice I said streamlined and not shortcut. You're not looking for excuses to minimize work. You're just taking the extra fluff and the unnecessary work out of the goal. And finally, the more specific the goal is, the more it'll help direct your behavior. Let's switch gears and discuss goal proximity. Goals can either be short-term or long-term, depending on context. I want to give a TED Talk versus I want to use my phone less. The interesting thing about proximity is that it affects the overall persistence of the goal setter and their intrinsic motivation. Short-term goals provide many opportunities for feedback and reinforcement, which motivates the person to keep going or not if the feedback is negative. However, on uninteresting tasks, short-term goals actually enhance intrinsic motivation through that positive feedback because it's easily achievable, and that leads to greater competence. Some things to be mindful of is that there are certain caveats or pitfalls when it comes to goal setting. They're really most effective when tasks are relatively uninteresting and require a very straightforward procedure. In this case, the goal itself is what generates the motivation that the initial task cannot. For genuinely interesting or creative tasks or tasks that require problem solving, goals won't enhance your performance in the sense that it won't magically boost your IQ or allow you to solve anything in front of you. But what it will do is provide that consistency, and those behavior directors will eventually lead you to solving that problem or completing that creative task. For our purpose, goal striving will be the process of attaining a goal through effort, persistence, focused attention, and strategic planning. Did you know that simply visualizing the aspects of your goals can be productive? We refer to that as mental simulations. This lowers the anxiety and even encourages planning for potential distractions and finding solutions early on, which obviously helps in the long run in the goal striving process. Now, I personally like to avoid saying the best method versus the worst method, but a truly good method you could begin to immediately use in your day-to-day lives is the if-then implementation method when creating your goals. Now, what does that look like? So instead of saying, I want to exercise more, you can say, if there are stairs, I will take them instead of taking the elevator. Instead of saying, I want to save money for my future, you can say, once I get paid, I'll then put $100 into my account. These very simple implementation intentions help people get started on their goal, stay on track, and take the ambiguity out of the goal striving process since you now have a clear plan of action. There are a few factors that can minimize or maximize its overall success, such as the overall difficulty and whether or not it's driven by extrinsic or intrinsic motivation. But the longer you proceed with these implementation intentions, the easier they'll be. Simply avoid creating implementation intentions that are too rigid because that'll restrict or discourage other behaviors that might actually end up helping promote that goal attainment. Now, what do we do if we simply just can't achieve our goals? Funny enough, some people will fail to disengage from a goal due to the fear of appearing weak or due to the sunk cost effect. That means that they'll start thinking, I've already come this far or I've already done this much. I might as well continue. And we're not discussing the goals that are just difficult, right? Goals should be difficult and the process should be difficult, right? That's how you enjoy the rewards. I'm talking about the goals that are genuinely impossible or unrealistic. If you keep the same effort and commitment, you're putting yourself at risk of psychological distress that may take months to recover from, i.e., burnout, right? If you give up your effort but still keep the commitment, you're putting yourself at psychological distress due to constantly envisioning that ideal state we talked about earlier, but without any kind of plan to get there. However, if you give up efforts and commitment and then adopt a new goal with different strategies, there's a much higher likelihood that you achieve that goal while simultaneously achieving psychological well-being. Well, we discussed quite a bit today. Hopefully these concepts have provided some new perspectives on a relatively intuitive topic. But now you have some more tools in your ever-growing psychological toolbox to use in your day-to-day lives. As always, this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm AJ, and this is the Psychosocial Approach. I'll catch you all in the next one.